Jenn Wilson, Senior Programmer with Film Independent. Before we get started, I have to give some praise to our supporters. Thank you to our incredible lead sponsor, the Hollywood Foreign Press Association, and our screening partners, Vision Media. If for those of you watching live today, please take advantage of the question box at the bottom of your screen and feel free to submit some questions for me to ask Errol towards the end of the Q&A today. And now, dear Film Independent members, if you're Errol Morris superfans like I am, today is both your birthday and Christmas. I'm so honored to have with me today an absolute legend. His career includes The Thin Blue Line, A Brief History of Time, Mr. Death, The Fog of War, Tabloid, Wormwood, and now My Psychedelic Love Story. Please welcome Oscar winner and two-time Film Independent Spirit Awards winner, Errol Morris. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me on.
Since
you're going to be nice to me, right?
I'm gonna be nice to you. Yes.
Thank you.
Since our many of our 7,000 plus members are filmmakers and aspiring filmmakers, I usually start with a question, just talking about your filmmaker origin story. Can you talk about how you became a filmmaker?
I think everything in my life has happened more or less by accident or out of some frustration or another. I was going to be, if anything, a writer / college professor, but that didn't quite work out. And I started watching films at the University of California. Well, I had always been watching films more or less, but I started watching films compulsively at Berkeley at the Pacific Film Archive. And I met a number of filmmakers, among them Werner Herzog, who I went to work for. And then I started out of nowhere to make a film. Why, I'm not sure. But I started making Gates of Heaven, and I just kept going. It's a habit. Maybe it's addictive. And for years, I couldn't be a filmmaker. No one wanted to employ me. I had made 2 films, Vernon, Florida, Gates of Heaven, and I was essentially forced to stop. You have to remember, when I started, there really was no place to show documentary films. It wasn't a career opportunity of any kind like it is today. It was a format that was unheralded, practiced by some people here and there, without much of a chance of distribution, without much of a chance of anybody seeing what you were doing. You could see it as a totally futile activity for those few obsessed enough with it to want to do it. Is that an origin story? I don't know.
Yeah, that's great. That's fantastic. I'm certainly glad that you kept doing it.
There's a line in Conan the Barbarian that I've always liked. It's a John Milius line. It used to be just another snake cult. Now you see it everywhere. That's how I feel about documentary.
Yeah. So the subject of this documentary, Joanna Harcourt Smith, how did you come to meet her? I think she says during her interview that she called you, right?
Yeah, she called me. She was interested in my film, my series for Netflix, Wormwood. She loved it. And she loved the work of my son, Hamilton, Hamilton's Pharmacopoeia. And she was hoping that either one of us, perhaps even both of us, would want to make this film with her. So that's how that started. I read her book, her self-published book. I talked with her a number of times on the phone, and then we arranged for her to come from Santa Fe up here to Boston, where we filmed her over 2 days, just 2 days. And the intention was to make a movie like Wormwood, a combination of drama and interview. But guess what happened in 2019? COVID-19, and it became really impossible to do much of anything.
Yeah.
We're fortunate that we could actually make the movie at all. And at one point, Vinny Malhotra at Showtime said, well, we'd like to get this done by the end of the year. Could you just do it in a different way and get it done? And we did.
What is it about the subjects of your documentaries, Joanna, and the other subjects of your other documentaries that make you know that they're a good interview subject, like good enough for a feature-length documentary?
Maybe I don't know. I mean, you don't.
I disagree, but
well, that's certainly your prerogative, but there's an element of fear every time I do this. You know, will the people be any good? Will they be able to talk? Can I make a movie out of this? There's lots of reasons to worry. And an interview properly done is an excursion into the unknown. You don't know what you're going to hear. You don't know what people are going to say. You may not even know ultimately what the story is going to be about. It's a process of uncovering material, discovering material. And if you're lucky, it's good.
You are famous for getting people to tell you things in interviews that are really unexpected, particularly in Thin Blue Line and Fog of War. Would you say that it's because of an interview style that you have, because of who you are? Why do you think that it is that people tell you unexpected things?
I don't think there's any kind of secret formula other than being interested in people and interested in what they have to say. I remember years ago, my picture was taken by Richard Avedon, and Avedon engaged me in conversation, but not perfunctory conversation, real conversation, like he was interested in listening to what I had to say. And then all of a sudden, poof, the flash goes off, the picture is taken, and it happens without any warning. And it's part of that process. And I believe that part of the process is being just interested in people, interested in what they have to say. I mean, I know when I go into an interview and people show up with a list of questions they're going to ask. And then they go through them one by one, tick them off one by one. Years ago, I made a film for the beginning of the Oscars. So I was required to interview a lot of people about their favorite movies, including, well, I had in the green room at one time, Donald Trump, Iggy Pop, Walter Cronkite, and Mikhail Gorbachev.
What was Donald Trump's favorite movie? I'm really curious about that.
What was used in the cut was Citizen Kane, was actually King Kong. he came, he conquered New York. I could identify with that. It was a line. But we talked at greater length about Citizen Kane. And there's a clip, it's on YouTube. YouTube, my talking to Trump about Citizen Kane. I love it, actually.
I'm definitely going to watch that now.
Because I asked him, do you have any advice for Charles Foster Kane? And he said, more or less spontaneously, get yourself a different woman. So that was his takeaway from Citizen Kane.
That was his advice to Charles Kane.
Indeed.
Okay.
Get yourself a different woman.
So with this film, so you've ended up making two, well, a TV series and a film now with peripheral LSD as a peripheral subject. Is LSD and the counterculture something that's a major area of interest for you in your life?
Not really, no. I probably much more in my son's life than in my life. I mean, I was certainly interested in wormwood. LSD is the MacGuffin. LSD is not the driving force of the story, but it certainly figures in the story. I don't believe that LSD is the driving force in my psychedelic love story, but it's certainly part of the story. Her fascination with Timothy Leary, her relationship with Timothy Leary, but it goes well beyond that.
Does it often happen to you where subjects for your films sort of come to you, or do you find yourself having to do a lot of research and sort of thinking about what you want to do for your next project?
I would say I have to do a lot of thinking, but I suppose in more recent years, there have been people coming to me about the possibility of my doing a film with them. It happens now more often, but it's usually me picking and choosing something for God knows whatever reason. I love tabloid stories. It's no secret. And for years, I wrote for the New York Times. And I remember telling one editor, you know, that inside of every copy of the New York Times, every day, there's a hidden tabloid story. You just have to go and look for it. Sometimes you don't even have to look for it. Sometimes it's on page one. My film, Mr. Death, with Fred Lucher, who was a Holocaust denier and a designer of execution equipment. What a combo platter. Where did I see that story? Front page of the New York Times. Okay, below the fold, front page of the New York Times with a picture and the heading, can capital punishment be humane? Nice question mark. And in the article, you had to actually go through the article to the very end, virtually the very end, to find out, and by the way, he happens to be a Holocaust denier. And when I saw the combination of the two, I found the story by and large irresistible. I think
I did too.
Many stories that just would repulse a normal, well-adjusted individual make me want to do more.
I have very vivid memories of seeing that movie. It was in Chicago at the Music Box Theater. And I didn't even know what a Holocaust denier was at the time that I had seen it, and was I think I felt the same attraction to it that you did. You know, it's kind of like shock and amazement, and but it turns out to be extremely relevant because it's, you know, more people on the planet than just him
Yes.
that have these thoughts. So let's talk
But
about your.
we found out the hard way in America
Yeah.
that, you know, self-deception, delusion is not an isolated phenomenon at all. In fact, it can afflict a large percentage of the population at large. Maybe no one wanted to find that out, but it's on display. I used to say if I wanted to read about the Nazis, you know, you had to open a whole number of books and read about the 1930s and 1940s in Germany. But today, I won't say exactly today, but for the last 4 years, all you had to do was open the paper if you wanted to read about fascism and about Nazis.
Yes. I wanted to ask you about your visual style. Your films have a particular a visual style that while we're watching someone do a long interview, it's often that we're hearing their voiceover and then seeing um, all kinds of images. How would you describe how you came about with the style of imagery? What do you use for inspiration? I noticed in this there were a lot of tarot cards in the design.
Well, Joanna was interested in tarot, and so was Leary. And it was part of the story, and I thought a visual element. It's something that I could work with, something that interested me. Again, you have to remember that we were handicapped by COVID-19. I wish I could have actually gone out and shot a lot more material. I wished I could have interviewed Joanna not just once, but several times. But we were constrained. In many ways, I feel lucky that we have a film. We could have ended up with nothing. And a film that actually I rather like. And Joanna liked it. Even more importantly, Joanna died last year, and the film was done early enough that she could watch it before she died. And the last week of her life, I was told that she watched it 5, 6, 7 times. And to me, it's an enormous gift that I was able to, in turn, give her a gift. And she was.
I bet it brought back a lot of great memories for her. Yeah, she's remarkable. She's a remarkable storyteller, and also she just opened herself up, you know, and became vulnerable. You could see her reliving these things as she's telling them and reliving her feelings that she had at the time. And I thought she's fascinating to listen to and watch. At times I was like, this story cannot be true. Like there's so much about it. And I was, because, you know, it, if they really were tripping on LSD the whole time, I'm not sure every bit of it is true. Did you wonder if every bit of it was actually true?
Wait a second. I know that when I talk to people, probably none of it's going to be true.
Okay.
That's not one of our great gifts as a species, is truth telling. Probably the greatest characteristic of people in general is self-deception. Having said all of that, I think there are huge swaths of this story that are true. Do I have a problem believing that there was a manhunt for Timothy Leary, that the government was after him, that CIA, FBI, Nixon's White House, these were targeted individuals where the United States had this vested interest in bringing them down, bringing them to justice, however you want to describe it. One of the things I like about the film, and some people have criticized the film, I mean, they'll say to me, did you fact check this? Did you fact check that? Well, yes, I fact checked almost everything in the film because that's what I do. But the film is not about fact checking per se. It's about Joanna Harker Smith's attempt to discover who she is and what was going on around her. In many ways, she remains a mystery to herself. Was she an agent of the government? It's like a Philip K. Dick question. Am I a tool in some kind of insane conspiracy? Am I acting individually? Am I acting as an independent agent? Or someone or something pulling the strings all around me? Am I a puppet for some invisible force that I can only feel, I can hint at, but I can never see? So that's, to me, at the heart of all of this, the feeling of not knowing who you are, not knowing why you're doing what you're doing, but feeling compelled to do it notwithstanding. She's a fabulously interesting person. I'm very, very sorry she's no longer with us. I really, really liked her.
Yeah, she was amazing. I wished that she was my grandma. The whole time I was like, oh my gosh, this woman would be the coolest grandma.
Yes.
Um,
Okay, I wish she was my grandma too. Except that we were roughly the same age, so it's unlikely that could work out.
She says, she tells her story of why she thinks that Timothy decided to cooperate. And that's that the psychiatrist threatened to feed him a lot of drugs until he went insane and put him in a corner of San Quentin. Do you think that's actually possible, that that was their plan?
I don't know. Do I think it's possible? Yes. Of course, we went both to the FBI and to the CIA and asked them whether any of this was true and what information they might have about Joanna and about Timothy. And we got the stock reply. It's almost a joke. They both told us we can neither confirm nor deny that we have any information related to Joanna Harker Smith or Timothy Leary. So that's the dead letter office. But do I think it's possible that they were being hunted? Even after he was captured and put in prison, that both of them were being hunted by the government, I find it entirely plausible.
What do you think is I guess the legacy? What do you think is the legacy of Timothy Leary? What do you think he would want his legacy to be?
Well, I don't know what he would want, but I do know it's a strange legacy. For many people, he's the devil. For many other people, he's a secular saint. some people feel that he destroyed the possibility of LSD being used for constructive purposes. Other people feel that he was very important in popularizing LSD as a venue towards enlightenment. He's a strange, ambiguous figure. I
Do you remember what you thought of him at the time,
I
at this time period?
met him just before he died at a party, and honest to God, he's the only person that I've ever met who actually seemed to be radiating light. Make of that what you will. But I did a double take. Is this how? I asked the person with me. He seems to be like a light bulb.
I believe that. I think you can see that in his interviews too.
But he had this insane smile, which he would turn on. You see it again and again and again and again. Force for good, force for evil, maybe a little bit of both. But one thing is pretty clear to me. As an observer, he was not terribly nice to women. He used them, he abandoned them repeatedly. And we know from this story that it had a devastating effect on Joanna. One day he was there, the next day he was gone without any explanation for his departure. One day he's part of her destiny, maybe he even defines her destiny. The next day he has no use for her. And that's a really very sad ending to the story.
I think he actually, he might be excited to learn that the psychedelics and mushrooms are actually being investigated, like truly investigated now for therapeutic properties. That was one of his main arguments, correct? That he thought these drugs could be used for treatments.
Yes. Well, we're now reaching a turning point. And we went through the Nancy Reagan era of just say no. And my feeling is just say yes, that drugs by and large have a beneficial effect, not a destructive effect. And I'll probably get myself into trouble for having said this. Maybe not all drugs, but many drugs that have been criminalized actually could help people and do help people.
So I wanted to ask you, did you ever have an idea for a film that you wanted to make or have wanted to make for a long time that you haven't yet been able to make for any reason?
Probably hundreds of them.
Yeah.
Most of the films I've wanted to make haven't been made. It's a little distressing, but I guess that's the way it goes. And I hope to be around for a while to continue to make films, because I find it frightening. I find it dreadful in many ways, but what else am I going to do with myself?
What is the film that you've made that you most often get asked about?
I don't know, maybe The Fog of War. The Thin Blue Line and The Fog of War both of them seem to hold people's interest, but um, I've now made a fair number of films, and I hope to keep it up.
Would you say that I in particular have enjoyed your films that involve crime themes, and I really enjoyed Wilderness of Error, your book, and the series that they just made about it, which is about the Jeffrey McDonald's trials. What would you say has attracted you to crime subjects in your films?
My mother years ago was very critical of the time that I was spending with killers. And I said, Mom, it's much better to talk to a killer than become one.
Have you interviewed a lot of killers now?
Oh, yes.
Or alleged killers?
No, I've interviewed alleged killers and the real thing, both.
When you one of the most famous things about Thin Blue Line is that you actually managed to elicit a confession from somebody in the film. What was that moment like for you? Was it shocking?
Well, the confession really isn't in the film. It is and it isn't. But there was a confession. I had spent literally years trying to get the guy who I believe was the killer on film, David Ray Harris. And he was in a jail outside of Dallas, Lew Sterrett jail. I finally got to interview him. My camera broke. It was a Friday night. My camera broke after I started my interview. And I thought my film is ruined. This is a disaster. I came back the next day with a tape recorder and recorded an interview with him. And the whole issue came down to how many people were in the car. It was stopped by this Dallas police officer who was shot and killed by the driver of this car. And I believe the guy who was sentenced to death for the murder of this police officer was innocent. He wasn't there. He was home. It's the worst excuse in the world, except it was true. He was home in bed. And this kid was alone in the car and shot the cop. He was the driver. And so in this interview, no camera present, I asked him, were you alone in the car when it was stopped by the Dallas police officer? It's the crucial question to ask. I suppose you could ask the question, do you shoot the cop? But this, to me, was the way to ask the question. And he just stared at me, and finally, he nodded his head. That's not on film. This is a very interesting and powerful case because all of the evidence, and this is rarely true in a true crime investigation, all of the evidence pointed to the guy who had been convicted and sentenced to death and who almost died in the Texas electric chair. All the evidence that I was able to unearth pointed to his innocence and to the guilt of this kid who was 16 years old at the time from South Texas. What an amazing story. You don't stumble on this kind of thing every day.
Had you, I'll say when I saw this film in the 90s, as part of a documentary class that I was taking, I had to watch Thin Blue Line and I had to watch Titicut Follies by Fred Wiseman. This film shaped the way that I see so many things. And it was actually, I think, the very first thing that I had seen about about a miscarriage of justice and how that actually happens piece by piece, part by part. And I know it was the beginning of a certain style of filmmaking. I mean, I think that you invented that. I think you've invented and reinvented a lot of documentary styles now. Had you thought about a lot about miscarriages of justice before making this film and sort of wanting to tell the story of how this happens?
I wasn't looking for miscarriage of justice. I mean, I was certainly aware of them. I wasn't even looking for this particular case. I was down in Dallas to interview this psychiatrist, Dr. James Grigson, who is known as the hanging psychiatrist or Dr. Death. It's a nice name. And I went down to Dallas to interview him. And he kept saying to me, you know, I don't know how many people he was responsible for sending to the electric chair. But in Texas, they had penalty phase to a capital murder trial. He would show up and he would say the same thing in every single case. The defendant is a dangerous sociopath. He will kill and kill. Again, I can say this with absolute certainty, unless he in turn is killed by the state. And he would get death sentence after death sentence after death sentence. Only problem in this case is the guy who he said was completely normal and wouldn't hurt a fly was the killer. And the guy who got sentenced to death was completely innocent of the crime. So there you go.
All right, I gotta take some questions from our members. Let's see what they have to ask. Well, someone just wanted, they said they're an ethnographer and a documentary filmmaker, and they wanted to say, you have the best interview style without a list of questions, which leads to more revelation. And thank you so much for that. Another person who's observing your talent for getting people to tell their stories. What were your feelings about Leary before making the film, and had you ever met him or seen his speaking tour with G. Gordon Liddy at NYU in the early 80s?
I hadn't at the time, but of course I saw it during the course of making this film. And of course I met him briefly as well. So I should tell you, oh, I can't speak right now. Sorry.
That's okay.
Where am I? Oh, I never finished the story, which I think is relevant. When I was making this film for the Academy, asking people about their favorite films, I was asked to interview Laura Bush in the White House. And the advanced team at the White House said to me, we need your list of questions that you're going to ask the First Lady. And I said, that's not what I do. I don't have a list of questions. And they said, you have to have a list of questions. And I said, but I don't work that way. I don't have a list of questions. So this went back and forth. I got down there, we're setting up to interview Laura Bush, and some guy comes out with a piece of paper with a list of questions on it. And answers, the questions I'm going to ask the First Lady and the answers that she's going to give me. And I looked at this thing. When the interview started, it said that her favorite movie was The Wizard of Oz. So I said, is your favorite movie really The Wizard of Oz? And she said, no, of course not. My favorite movie is Giant. I stood in line as a little girl uh, hoping to be cast as an extra. And she was, and I think maybe if you look carefully, I've never found it, but if you look carefully enough in Giant, you can find Laura Bush.
Laura Bush is an extra in Giant.
Yes.
Interesting. Why did they have her as Wizard of Oz was her favorite film?
You tell me.
Have you ever thought of doing a film on Donald Trump?
Well, I did interview him. This may come as no surprise to anybody, but I would be indeed truly grateful never to hear from this man again. As they say often enough is enough.
One of our viewers wants to know, what is that white animal in the background?
It's a fledgling penguin.
Do you have any plans
Doesn't everybody have them?
Yeah, I think, right? They're really popular. Do you have any plans to do a project with your son, Hamilton?
We'll see what happens. I don't think so, but we talk all the time. He did a podcast with me about my psychedelic love story. So
he has a podcast?
Yeah, I'm probably the last person in America not to have a podcast.
Will you interview Steve Bannon again?
I think once is enough.
Once in a lifetime.
You know, there's this famous story about Voltaire, and he had gone to an orgy and he was invited back to another orgy, and he declined, saying, once a philosopher, twice a pervert.
That's a good one. I'll do the last question as a wrap up.
You know whether I'm upset about him being pardoned? Yes, I'm upset about him being pardoned. He's a bad guy.
Do you know what your next project is going to be?
Well, I'm already working on a whole mess of them, so yes,
yeah.
I do.
Can you say anything about what your next projects are going to be?
Probably shouldn't.
Okay. So my psychedelic love story is...
But then someone will start yelling at me, and then I'll feel bad about myself. Maybe recriminations and regrets. Just the best to say nothing.
Do you think you would write any more books like Wilderness of Error?
Yes.
That's possibly a project on the horizon that you can't talk about?
Indeed.
So my psychedelic love story is currently playing on Showtime, right? Streaming on Showtime?
I believe it is.
I didn't know if it had opened yet. I saw it at a festival, so one of the few festivals that I played at.
Showtime, and I hope everybody gets a chance to see it. I think it's a good film.
Well, thank you so much for joining me today. I would love to someday, if you ever have the time, do an actual career retrospective interview with you so that we could talk more about your other films. So please reach out to me if you would ever be into doing that. Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you for doing this, and thanks everybody involved. A great pleasure. Thank you.
Bye.